Hey everyone, Rose here, and it's sculpting time. I'm finally feeling a bit better, so I can record some voiceover again. Yay! That being said, if I sound a bit weird, that's because I've been down with a bit of a cold for the past 2 weeks and it's not quite gone yet. Anyway, I made a 3D model of this Husky character here as a commission a couple of weeks ago, and in this video I'll be sharing with you the first part of the process, which is sculpting, and I'll be explaining part of the process and like some of the choices I made along the way, especially in terms of like what I use ZBrush for and what I use Blender for. So I hope you guys can get something out of it, and without further ado, on with the time-lapse. I've been using Blender to sculpt for a couple of years now, but I recently got into ZBrush because I've been running into like limits in terms of how much resolution Blender can handle and stuff like that, and ZBrush is built for sculpting a bit more. So over the past few months I've kind of developed a workflow that uses both softwares. I could make an entire sculpt like this in just Blender. I've done that for a lot of my other recent sculpts, up until the point where I even got ZBrush. And at this point, with like all the ZBrush stuff I'd learned, I could probably even make a whole sculpt like this in just ZBrush. But there are different things I find easier in one program versus the other one. As you can see, I start the whole process in Blender. I do most of my blocking here and figure out all the proportions and basic shapes and stuff like that, because I find just the general process of adding in individual objects and moving them around and adjusting like their scale and rotation and all of that good stuff is just a lot easier and more manageable here in Blender than it is in ZBrush. ZBrush obviously also has transform tools, and it has options to transform several objects at once, but for some reason I always find them a bit finicky. It's a lot easier for me to just jump into object mode and just rotate stuff around, or even just have multiple separate objects in edit mode at the same time and adjust them that way. I've also just really gotten used to using skin modifiers to block out my limbs and stuff like that. Sometimes, like for the legs, I just use one setup for the whole limb. Sometimes, like with the arms, I have several different objects, and I can like separate them and join them together relatively easily. ZBrush also has like the Z-spheres that work kind of similarly and create a similar effect, but I haven't messed around with them that much. From what I've seen, it's a lot better if you're making sort of like the whole model as a base armature, but it's not as good for easily separating stuff out and making kind of like sausage bits for all the limbs. Another slightly less obvious thing I prefer in Blender a bit is just like how the interface looks. The ZBrush interface is a lot more customizable, like you can make all those custom menus and put them where you want, but for some reason I always end up with very little space dedicated to the actual like kind of 3D viewport where I'm sculpting. There's just a whole lot of stuff all around the sides, versus in Blender I can relatively easily like limit that. Like I have my one brush menu on this one side and my like properties menu on the other side, and that's pretty much it, and I can collapse them when I don't need them. And I even have space for like a couple of extra viewports, which is great for videos because you can kind of see a less jerky view of what I'm doing, and it allows me to just see how like the overall proportions and stuff are coming along without having to zoom back out all the way constantly. Anyway, back to the process itself. You'll probably have noticed that up until this point I've spent very little time actually sculpting in sculpt mode. I've spent most of my time in object mode, like scaling and rotating all my pieces, duplicating them, adding new ones. I've been in edit mode a lot, messing around with my skin modifier sausages so that they have the right shape. The only things I've really sculpted much are stuff like the head, the snout and the ears, or the torso, that aren't as easy to make from a simple primitive like a sphere or one of my skin modifier pieces. And even there, it's mostly just been getting the very basic shape in place, not much in terms of like refining or detailing or anything like that. I'm only really moving on to applying all the modifiers and really getting into sculpting now that I'm really happy with how the proportions look. I can still tweak that and move stuff around and stuff later on, but the further I am along in the sculpting process, the harder it gets to change things. And even now that I am actually sculpting, I'm not taking my resolution particularly high, and I'm not really merging many of my objects together yet. I'm focusing more on getting all the volumes more or less right and starting to define some of my edges to just make sure all the underlying shapes and proportions are really just the way I want them. All the more detailed stuff I'm gonna do later in ZBrush because it's a bit easier there and I'll have a better time keeping things nice and smooth and even. For this part of the process, I use stuff like the inflate brush and the various grab brushes to adjust all the volumes and make that stuff look right, and then stuff like the crease brush to start really defining those important edges, like around the joints and in the face and stuff like that. A really helpful thing I use for the fingers every once in a while is the ability to link object data together. That means I can just sculpt one finger and all the sculpting information gets carried over to the remaining fingers automatically. I just have to remember to unlink them later on because annoying stuff tends to happen or not work when you have linked geometry. Like you can't apply modifiers and annoying stuff like that. One thing I didn't use very much for this model, but definitely prefer in Blender over ZBrush, is box modeling or poly modeling or whatever you want to call it. ZBrush has the Z Modeler brush, and that works for small things every once in a while, but for the most part, I find Blender edit mode just a lot easier and more intuitive to use, like here for the teeth or earlier for the eyes. Anyway, at this point I'm happy with the basic proportions and everything I've made over here in Blender, so it's time to head over to ZBrush to do all the nitty-gritty sculpting. If you are using both ZBrush and Blender together, I'd highly recommend using the Gobi add-on. It's a huge godsend and it's gonna save you a whole bunch of time doing like importing and exporting and stuff like that. Once you have it, all you really have to do is select all your objects and press export and stuff will instantly be transported into ZBrush. You don't even need to like import it manually on the other end. And for the way back, you just have to make sure import is turned on in Blender and you can just use the Go Z button in ZBrush to instantly pack that back over. I'll put a link in the description to a video explaining how you install all that and set it up. Definitely use that if you're gonna be using ZBrush and Blender together. And in ZBrush, I go around defining like my edges and plane changes a bit more. I started that a little bit in Blender, but I'm gonna do it a bit more here in ZBrush because using like the dam brush and the pinch brush here, I can get my edges a bit cleaner and just smoother. In Blender, I sometimes have a bit of an issue where I'm using my crease brush on an edge and from one angle it looks like perfectly nice and smooth, but then when I turn it around it's weirdly bumpy. If you're careful and know what you're doing, you can get nice and smooth edges in Blender too, but it's a bit easier and more straightforward in ZBrush. I also feel a bit more confident here going into more details, especially around like the face and stuff earlier on, because remeshing two subtools together here is slightly more reliable than in Blender. In Blender, if you remesh to a very high resolution, sometimes it really lags or crashes or something like that, and here I haven't had that issue yet with Dynamesh, which is great. Another thing that I incorporated into my workflow that I didn't do much in Blender when I was only sculpting in Blender is taking a singular object and separating that out into separate meshes. Also, I'm going to be using the terms object and subtool interchangeably because the term subtool upsets me greatly. I'm not going to get into that. Either way, for the toes here, they started out as one subtool and I separated them out into separate pieces so I could adjust them a bit more and edit the shape a bit better, and that's a really like useful thing to do. You might actually have noticed me doing something very similar earlier in Blender, which was for the jaw using mask slice to new object or something like that. So this is something that's definitely carried over to working there too. That being said, it does work a bit more reliably in ZBrush. You might have noticed earlier I got some weird scaling issues with a new object. And here in ZBrush it all went a bit smoother, and I was able to use the Z-remesher to give the whole thing a bit more even topology that I could more easily deform and sculpt later. And speaking of the Z-remesher, if I had to point to one singular thing that made sculpting in ZBrush more convenient than Blender, it would definitely be the Z-remesher. It's really good at creating a nice and clean topology very quickly, which is something you need if you're gonna be sculpting with subdivisions. Blender has a multi-resolution modifier, which works pretty much the same as ZBrush's subdivisions. The problem is that in order to use multi-resolution or subdivisions, you need a clean base topology, and Blender just doesn't have a way to get that quickly. There's the relatively new quad remesher, but I've tried it out a couple of times and it's really not good. Definitely not anywhere near comparable to the Z-remesher. Anyway, that means if you want to use the multi-res modifier to sculpt in Blender, you pretty much have to do your retopology first, and then go back in and add your details with multi-res. And that's something that's possible. I've done that before in one of my sculpts. I'll link that up above if I remember. But it takes a lot longer, and it sort of takes you out of the sculpting mindset, in my opinion. More importantly, it means you can't go back in and make changes that might stretch out your topology, and you can't really use multi-resolution throughout your process. Really only at the very beginning, when you still have good topology from whatever you were using to block, and at the very end when you have already done your retopology. Meanwhile, here in ZBrush, I found myself switching between Dynamesh and Z-remesher and subdivisions quite a lot. There were situations where I wanted a nice and smooth surface, so I'd Z-remesh and sculpt that for a while with subdivisions. Then I would join two objects together and I needed to use Dynamesh again to merge them properly. And I could relatively quickly and easily just switch between those two things depending on what I needed or just felt like using for any given situation. And there are handfuls of situations where I wasn't quite happy with the topology the Z-remesher gave me just with default settings, and even there I could use stuff like polygroups to sort of adjust how it remeshed everything and give myself a topology that would be more convenient to use for the thing I was working on. I did that once when I was working on just the body, and then also later on when I merged everything together to sculpt in the final details. One thing you should keep in mind is it's a remesher, not a retopology tool. It gives you really good topology for base sculpting, but that's still not like final model kind of topology that you would want to use to like rig and stuff like that. So I still had to retopologize this model later, even though I used this remesher for the last bit of the sculpt. I'll be uploading the time-lapse for that either as a short bonus video at some point this week or next week as like a longer talky video again in combination with a rig. Who knows? Depends on like how my life goes over the course of the next week, I guess. Damn, talking is not good for my throat. This was a terrible idea, but now I started, I can't just like stop the voiceover in the middle of it. I'm gonna survive. I'm gonna like make a tea and continue. Another thing I noticed with ZBrush while like watching back the footage here, as well as while working on my most recent sculpt, which I did just in Blender, is that I have a lot easier time like keeping my sculpt smooth at high resolutions in ZBrush compared to Blender. I can still do it in Blender, especially with a remesher, and if I turn up the strength of the smooth brush just like over 1, but I had an easier time in ZBrush keeping stuff smooth, even just using Dynamesh, and it was even better using subdivisions and ZRemesher. Here you can actually see me using the mask to create all my poly groups, and then using those poly groups with the ZRemesher to sort of control the topology I get. The first automatic topology I got was already pretty good, but since I wanted to go on to sculpt with subdivisions, I wanted to make sure I didn't have too many poles and awkward places, so taking the bit of extra time to make all your poly groups was definitely worth it. That being said, do make sure that you don't have a couple of like really tiny poly groups in places, because those tend to mess up the topology a little bit. I had those at the bottom of the feet here, and it wasn't too terrible because I was gonna remesh later anyway, but if this is gonna be like your final remesh, then like pay attention to that. It can be really annoying. It's a little bit annoying that you have to use like a mask and then convert that into a poly group. Here in ZBrush, it would be a bit easier if you could just paint them directly, then you could avoid these little edges a bit more easily, because the mask doesn't give you the same kind of hard edge that the poly groups are gonna have, so it's not always 100% obvious like where the boundary of your poly group is gonna be. It's probably slightly easier if you use like a slice function or something like that, but I don't know enough ZBrush to do that. I'm gonna have to like work on figuring that out. Gonna do that at some point, maybe, probably not, who knows. In general in ZBrush there are like a whole bunch of tools and features and brushes and things that are called brushes but are not really brushes that I haven't tried out, and I really should, but I just kind of focused on the things that I would need for my kind of basic workflow to begin with, and I'm just kind of hoping that I'll come across other interesting, useful features as I go. And speaking of things that are called brushes but aren't actually what most people would consider a brush, even in a digital software, the IMM brushes and the ZModeler brush. I have tried them out, they are not my friends. I prefer doing that stuff in Blender. But in this case I made the eyebrows using IMM Curve Tube brush and the ZModeler brush because I didn't want to go through the hassle of moving it over to Blender and back, because at this point the model is quite high poly, so it would take a while to move back and forth. Either way, I find just regular edit mode in Blender to be a lot more intuitive to use than the ZModeler brush. It's a bit annoying with how you have to sort of hover over things to get the options that you want, and also just like the fact that all the tools are condensed down into one brush and you have to find them in a whole long menu. Very annoying. I prefer just a regular modeling layout for that. As for the IMM brushes, which I also mentioned that I do not get along with well, those are probably a bit better. Like, if I got used to using them a bit more, I'd probably get along with them quite well and use them a lot more, but in general, I do find just like the regular process of adding in extra objects in Blender to be a bit easier than using an IMM to insert a new whatever shape, which is why I did my blocking and proportion figuring out in Blender, and I didn't really add any extra objects once I was in ZBrush except for the eyebrows. There's also the IMM like curve stuff, which in this case I used one for the eyebrows, but in that case I didn't really need it to have much in terms of curvy properties. I just needed like a thing that I could then deform into eyebrows. But I've messed around with like trying to use them for something like hair on a sort of experiment sculpt while I was learning, and it's really not as nice as just using NURBS curves in Blender. I do like the fact that I can go back in and edit them quite easily, or like change the profile of the curve and stuff like that. And that's kind of missing for me in ZBrush. So whenever I do my next like character with long curve hair, the hair is going to be done in Blender again, probably, not ZBrush. One thing I do like more here in ZBrush than I do in Blender that's also not relevant for this sculpt is poly paints. I tried them out a bit in, like, again, a random sculpt I made that I didn't record, and they worked quite well. Blender, obviously the new versions, if you've seen my recent videos, have the new sculpt vertex paint, but that's also only in the experimental versions of Blender. And it's gonna be nice to be able to use something like that just like in default ZBrush. Plus ZBrush has like a couple of extra settings I can use with the paints, and I can use them in combination with the layers and actually like layer the color over each other. I'm not quite sure how I'm gonna export that, but I'll figure that out whenever I actually use it. At this point, the sculpt itself is slowly nearing completion. I've joined all the objects together, or like subtools together that need to be joined together. I've remeshed them properly. I used the Z-remesher on the main body using the poly groups again to sort of direct the topology the way I wanted it. I've reprojected all the detail I previously sculpted, so I don't have to like start from scratch sculpting all of that. And now I just have to go around the entire model, adding in all the final details where they're needed. Something interesting about working in Blender and ZBrush together for one sculpt is that not all parts of the model get equal amounts of sort of work in each program. For example, for the claws, I made those in Blender and then just didn't do anything with them in ZBrush, except for duplicating them and moving them to the feet too, because I had forgotten to make the like foot claws in Blender. And for something like the teeth, I didn't remesh them at any point. I just kept the original topology kind of that I had from when I box modeled them in Blender and just subdivided that to sculpt in the remaining details. Then on the flip side, there's something like the body where I just did the very basic blocking in Blender, and I've dynameshed it a whole bunch of times. I've remeshed it several times, and it just looks completely different now out of ZBrush than it did when I first brought it in from Blender. Different parts of the model just require kind of different processes to make, and so they require different amounts of time kind of in each program. Anyway, at this point I'm down to the final finishing touches. On this model, I'm just adding in all the last bits of fur to just add a bit of detail and not make him look completely smooth. I also break symmetry in parts for this so that it doesn't look weirdly symmetrical. It's really convenient in ZBrush that it's just like one button press to change the symmetry. You can use just X to turn it on and off. In Blender, I always have to go up to the top to turn it on and off. I don't think that even has a hotkey. And even if I like forget to turn on symmetry at some point, ZBrush actually has a few more options to relatively quickly fix it. Like if you look down to the bottom of my screen, I've pinned the mirror and weld and mirror options to the bottom of my workspace because I use them a lot because I constantly forget to turn on symmetry when I actually want to use it. And those options just make it really quick to symmetrize your whole model. Blender doesn't have as much of a quick and easy option for that, at least none that I've found. Also, for the fur, I should probably like either make or buy some like nice fur detail brushes for ZBrush, or even better is like one I could use in ZBrush and Blender, because it really takes quite a long time to sculpt in all these little bits of fur manually. In this case, I kind of had to because this model is part of a sort of set. Some of the other character modeling commissions I did recently were all like sort of for the same person, for the same project, so it would be slightly weird if one of them just had completely different fur. But still, for the future, acquiring some nice fur alpha brushes would probably be very useful. Also, I tried out the layers in ZBrush while sculpting the fur. They looked like they would be very useful. They weren't actually very helpful for what I did here, but in future sculpts I might like try and use them more. Anyway, with the last few fluff details done, the sculpt is complete. And here's the final sculpt. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and maybe got something out of it. I feel like this workflow was maybe kind of niche, like a lot of the things I find easy and difficult are because of the experience I already have. But maybe there are some of you who have been using Blender to sculpt for a while and are considering getting into ZBrush and don't quite know how to approach a workflow. Or maybe there's some of you who have been using ZBrush for a while but find some parts of the process to be a bit frustrating. And for you, maybe my video could give you some inspiration on how to incorporate both Blender and ZBrush into your workflow or something like that. Anyway, that's been all for this sculpt. I'll be uploading the rest of the process for this model over the next week or two. Either just as basic time lapses or maybe with some more talking stuff, depending on what you guys think or what I have time for. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that. And maybe check out the description. I have some of my other social media linked there, as well as the Discord server. So if you want to maybe see some more of my art or hang out and chat, definitely go take a look at that. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a nice rest of your day and see you all next time.